Ja, dames en heren, graag wil ik u hartelijk welkom heten voor de bijeenkomst van vanmiddag. Tegen de markt resten slechts buitenparlementaire vormen van protest, zegt Wolfgang Streeck. U hoort het al, het gaat om een thema dat betrekking heeft op de actuele crisis van economie en democratie. Centraal staat het boek van Streeck over de Gekochte Tijd, de uitgestelde crisis van het democratisch kapitalisme. Omdat de voertaal van deze bijeenkomst Duits zal zijn, wil ik... Engels? Ah, oké, wauw. In het Goethe Institut Engels, perfect. Engels zal zijn, maar ik wil doen mijn kort inleiding in Duits. Ik wil hartelijk bedanken voor de prettige samenwerking met uitgeverij Leesmagazijn. Het jager van Leesmagazijn was de initiatiefnemer van diese Bijeenkomst. So, und jetzt aber doch ein paar Worte auf Deutsch. Also ich darf ganz herzlich begrüßen Professor Wolfgang Streeck. Wolfgang Streeck ist sicherlich einigen schon bekannt als Direktor Emeritus am Max-Planck-Institut für Gesellschaftsforschung in Köln. Es begann alles vor langer Zeit, denke ich mal, in Frankfurt, in New York mit dem Studium, später dann Münster, dann kam die Promotion in Frankfurt, Habilitation in Bielefeld und 1995 ging es dann an die University of Wisconsin-Madison als Professor für Soziologie und industrielle Beziehungen. Nach dieser, oder besser muss ich sagen, während der Studienzeit noch, und das möchte ich ganz gerne betonen, weil ich immer sehe, es hat eben doch die Biografie auch mit der späteren Forschungsarbeit zu tun, war Wolfgang Streeck Mitglied im Sozialdemokratischen Hochschulbund, Mitbegründer des Sozialistischen Büros in Offenbach. 1995 dann schließlich die Tätigkeit, die er jetzt bis zum Schluss hatte, Direktor am Max-Planck-Institut für Gesellschaftsforschung in Köln. Dort in der gleichen Stadt übernahm er dann auch 1999 die Professur an der Fakultät für Wirtschafts- und Sozialwissenschaften. Seit 1998 gehört Wolfgang Streeck der Brandenburgischen Akademie der Wissenschaften an und wie gesagt, im Oktober, Ende Oktober letzten Jahres erfolgte dann die Emeritierung. Schwerpunkt seiner Arbeiten sind Fragestellungen aus den Bereichen Wirtschaft und Politik und deren Wechselbeziehungen. Und ich denke, man kann sagen, er bedient sich dabei eines historisch vergleichenden institutionellen Ansatzes. Streeck war, ich habe es schon kurz erwähnt, lange Jahre Mitglied der SPD. Es gab dann allerdings ein Ereignis, ich war zu dieser Zeit noch nicht in den Niederlanden, ich kann es nur vermuten, einen Nachklang auch hier gehabt haben muss, nämlich die Thesen von Thilo Sarrazin. Sarrazins rassistisch gefärbte, populistische Thesen waren seinerzeit ein Grund, die SPD insofern zu verlassen, als sie nicht sich von Sarrazin trennen konnte. Ja, die Fiskalkrise hat sich jetzt zu einer fundamentalen Krise im Verhältnis von Demokratie ausgewachsen. Ein Thema, was viele Forscher europaweit beschäftigt. Wolfgang Streeck hat mehrfach auch mit Colin Crouch zusammen publiziert. Die Frage, die sich eigentlich immer stellt, die auch inzwischen die Literatur längst erfasst hat, Ingo Schulze hat das mal aufgegriffen im Hinblick auf ein Diktum von Angela Merkel, unserer Bundeskanzlerin, nämlich zur Frage marktkonforme Demokratie ist das wünschenswert, erstrebenswert, dem hielt er entgegen, was wir eigentlich brauchen, sind demokratiekonforme Märkte. Also diese Frage, wer regiert hier wen, welche Dominanz bildet sich hier aus, das sind Fragen, die in den Forschungsarbeiten sicherlich auch bei Wolfgang Streeck immer wieder hervortreten. Die Frage der Staatsverschuldung ist ein zentrales Thema und die abnehmende Handlungsfähigkeit des Staates und die dahinterstehende, wahrscheinlich noch viel drückender und gefährlichere Frage für die Demokratie, ob damit diese Staaten eventuell auch zu Geiseln der Banken werden. Eigentlich, es gibt da ein Zitat von Wolfgang Streeck von 2013, geht es um die immerwährende Frage, geht es jetzt hier um die Forderung des Finanzsektors an die Staaten? Ist das, was Vorrang haben soll oder schon längst Vorrang hat? Oder geht es noch oder eigentlich um Forderungen der Bürger an die Staaten? Ich darf herzlich auch begrüßen Herrn Ewald Engelen. Er ist Professor für finanzielle Geografie an der Universität in Amsterdam und Publizist. Das Leesmagazijn hat von ihm die Europese Mythesboekje voor Burgers herausgegeben und zuletzt, wenn ich richtig informiert bin, erschien sein Buch des Schaduw-Elite, also die Schatteneliten, wenn ich das richtig übersetze, in Amsterdam im letzten Jahr herausgekommen. Mein besonderer Dank gilt nochmals der heutigen Zusammenarbeit mit dem Verlag Leesmagazijn, von dem, wie gesagt, die heutige Initiative ausging. En zoals altijd nodigen we u na afloop voor een borreltje beneden in onze cafeteria. Aber bevor wir dorthin gehen, möchte ich gern Frank Kaiser bitten, hier zu übernehmen. Dankeschön.
Goedemiddag, ook namens de uitgeverij. Welkom geheten in het Goethe Instituut op deze presentatie van het bijzondere boek van professor Wolfgang Streeck. Dank aan het Goethe Instituut ook voor de samenwerking. Fijn dat we hier kunnen zijn. Mijn naam is Frank Kaiser. Ik werk voor het Leesmagazijn als redacteur. En ik heb samen met Menno Grootveld, mede-uitgever, dit boek mogen begeleiden. En dat is even uitdagend als boeiend geweest. Een van de beste boeken over de crisis, misschien wel. En daar gaan we vandaag meer over horen met, zoals al aangekondigd, Wolfgang Streeck zelf. Welkom, welcome, professor Streeck again. En Ewald Engelen, welkom. Zij zullen straks in gesprek gaan over het boek. En tot slot zal er ook ruimte zijn voor het publiek om vragen te stellen. Ik nodig graag Ewald Engelen en Wolfgang Streeck uit op het podium plaats te nemen. Ik wens u een prettige dag.
Wolfgang, you asked me to speak to you by calling your first name, so that's what I'm going to do. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a big honor for both Goethe Institut, Leesmagazijn, and me myself that we have the esteemed scholar Wolfgang Streeck in our midst on occasion of the Dutch translation of his book, Gekochte, Tijd, as it was originally called in German. We're going to do a Q&A. I have read the book and I have decided upon 4 different sorts of topics on which Wolfgang will have plenty of opportunity to respond. But before we do so, let me briefly say something about the academic prestige of Wolfgang. He is one of the most quoted, one of the most prolific authors in a field that could be called comparative institutionalism or comparative political economy. He has written a large number of books which basically describe the transformations of contemporary capitalism in its sort of national state-based mode. Historical books about the development of Japanese capitalism in contrast to German capitalism, as well as all sorts of publications on the current transformations of capitalism. Within academia, he is the absolute expert on comparative institutional issues related to labor markets, the interfaces between the economy and the political democratic system, as well as a whole range of other issues. So it's a great honor to have him here. Okay. The first topic that I want to talk about is, from my side, a little bit personal, but it's also personal in terms of the type of answer that you may or may not provide to that question. When I started out in my academic career in the early 90s, when I was doing a master thesis, my supervisor advised me to read this collection of essays by Wolfgang Streeck. It was a book published in 1992, the very same year when the Treaty of Maastricht was signed. I know it was a year later, but okay. It was December 1991, wasn't it? And I relied strongly in my master thesis on this particular book. When I was doing that, I was talking about this to progressive colleagues of mine who sort of criticized me for doing that because Wolfgang Streeck was merely a mainstream social democrat. That was the criticism. So I shouldn't take it too seriously. Now flash forward to 2014 when this book was published, or was it 2013? It was 2013, based on a series of lectures, the Adorno lectures. And I would like to read one quote out of this book. And that quote is going to be in German. It's on page 78. And here is the quote. Let me see where it starts. Die Utopie des gegenwärtigen Krisenmanagements ist dann auch die mit politischen Mitteln betriebene Vollendung der schon weit vorangekommenen Entpolitisierung der politischen Ökonomie, zementiert in reorganisierten Nationalstaaten unter der Kontrolle internationaler, gegen demokratische Beteiligung isolierter Regierungs- und Finanzdiplomatie mit einer Bevölkerung, die in langen Jahren hegemonialer und Umerziehung gelehrt haben müsste, die Verteilungsergebnisse sich selbst überlassener Märkte für gerecht oder doch für alternativlos zu halten. From a mainstream social democrat to someone who formulates a quite radical, critical analysis of contemporary financialized capitalism. Well, from these two contrasting pieces of observation follow very obvious questions. What happened to Wolfgang Streeck? Is it you that has changed, or is it the world that has changed?
I remember my school Latin, where it says, tempora mutantur, et nos mutamur cum illis. The times are changing and we're changing with them. In the 1970s and in the 1980s, the utopian idea of social democracy was still alive, that you could combine a socially responsible management of economic and social affairs with flourishing capitalism. And I certainly held on to this hope, especially when I was a professor in the United States. as you said, at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which was or had been one of the centers of the ideas that inspired the New Deal, American labor law, unemployment insurance, John R. Commons. When my department met, we used to meet in the John R. Commons room. So yeah, then in the later it became more difficult to continue to believe this. In the United States, the Clinton reforms were going on, the end of welfare as we know it. And when I came back to Germany in 1995, the German, or specifically German, configuration of a political economy governed by a tripartite alliance between government, capital, and labor, a labor-inclusive political economy, was beginning to crumble. It took some time for me to really understand what was behind this. I had worked on labor and not on capital. After a brief period in which I was involved in an attempt to reorganize the German welfare state so that it became sustainable.
When was that?
That was when Schröder came in, 1998.
Yeah.
But it was not the agenda, because I was there only for 2 years, and the agenda was then started in 2003.
These are the Hartz reforms.
Yeah, the Hartz reforms.
Yeah.
Our effort failed because we were no longer able to bring together the three sides. My role would have been to negotiate a compromise.
The side of capital.
Capital, labor, and government. Yeah, that was important. That's a long story, but then I began to return to scholarly work, and the book that appeared in 2009, a few months after the crisis, was called Reforming Capitalism, but with a hyphen between the re and the forming, where I trace the development of German political economy since the 1970s, and I saw this enormous dynamism of liberalization, even in a place where you wouldn't have expected this, Germany. Then, in the introduction to the book, I wrote that the 2008 crisis had just begun when I gave the book to the publisher, and I thought, for a moment, I hesitated to withdraw it and rewrite it. Yeah. This book here is then taking seriously what we've learned in 2008, namely that all the wonderful institutions that we devised in the post-war era to protect labor, to stabilize labor markets, to give people a perspective, all of these wonderful institutions can disappear in a moment when the financial system collapses. And that we were able to observe this already in the Mediterranean countries, in the United States anyway. And this scared me. And the book has this element of frightened observation in it.
Can you come up with any sort of explanation for why it is that politicians, regulators, but also academics failed to perceive what took place behind the screens in financial markets and banks?
We're faced with something that we didn't have yet in the history of capitalism, which is gradual, but at the same time fundamental change. The combination of slow change, which is incremental, and if a new generation comes in, they don't even observe it. Students today believe that the world was always like this, that you had to prepare for your career already at age 15, if not at age 5, and that you had to fight your fellow students in order to get a good job.
Competition all over the place.
Competition all over the place. Yeah. People take this as sort of self-evident. This is the way the world is. It wasn't in my time. And so this sort of gradual development is something that intrigues me. How can a fundamental change result from incremental change. Well, why is that? My answer to this is that we have to learn that in our modern capitalist societies, even in the 21st century, there are mechanisms of expansion, of the growth of markets, of the undermining of non-market institutions, a dynamism that sort of is inherent in this system that takes people and makes them agents of this dynamic. And that, as Polanyi has shown us already in the first half of the 20th century, that unless there are countervailing forces that contain this dynamic movement, this system is able to eat up spheres of life that we initially thought would never would never be subsumed under the logic of capital accumulation. Take the universities. So, terrific or terrifying example. Yeah. Take the family that in the last 20, 30 years was sort of rebuilt in our societies to fit the requirements of an unstable labor market, rather than the other way around, fit the labor market to the needs of families. So this sort of dialectical situation is even emphasized by the fact that capitalism is always in danger of undermining resisting forces on which it depends. Things like Treu und Glauben, trust, confidence, social solidarity are commodities that are first essential for the functioning of an economic system, and second, always at risk of being sort of consumed by this system. And so that the historical story was always that by containing the dynamics of capitalism, we were not just helping ourselves, but we were also helping capitalism to remain a viable system. Like unions who create a welfare state, high wages, therefore stabilize aggregate demand, therefore make it possible that the system can work. And now we're at a very strange period in which it looks like that these forces of resistance are so weakened that the system is sort of moving forward into a Pyrrhic victory. They are now able to consume resources that are fundamentally necessary for the system to survive, and that's something that I try to catch in the last part of the book, where I say, unfortunately, we can't specify who the agent would be, who would contain this financialized monster. Yeah, the monster has a free rein because it acts globally, and we can only act locally because we're human beings, and human beings are less universal than money.
But if you, for instance, look at the Financial Times this morning, there was this piece about what's it again? The Big Mac guy, the corporation who McDonald's. McDonald's indicating that they wanted to increase the wages of all the workers. A couple of weeks ago, the big supermarket chain in the United States did the same. This sort of suggests that at the end of the day, capitalists themselves perceive that they are undermining the whole system, and hence have to find some sort of a new equilibrium. Yeah, is that something that is going on? Do you see positive signs which suggest that indeed we do perceive that demand is actually the crucial variable in contemporary capitalism?
You see sort of ups and downs, and as Ford when he noticed that he wants his workers to be able to buy the cars that he was producing, where he raised their wage to $5 an hour, which was the beginning of mass production and Fordism. We saw it didn't prevent the system from moving into its worst crisis in the 20th century, in the early why?
Due to finance.
Yeah, due to finance, and also, I must say, due to the fact that insular solutions, like one company, it might be as big as you want, cannot compensate for this development. If we look at what we've observed in the last 30 years, I've become very fond of trajectories, of curves, rather than models. So my intellectual learning in this period was to don't look at models. Models are always sort of hyper clean. The world is more messy.
Yeah.
But what is interesting is where the world moves. And if we look at the long-term trajectory, and in this case not of individual countries in capitalism, but of the OECD capitalist world, you see three trends that are sort of moving in parallel. One is increasing inequality. The other is declining growth rates. And the third is increasing indebtedness all over the place. And if you look at these three things, the really frightening thing is that there's enough theory to suggest that they're not independent from each other.
No, sure.
Declining growth rates have something to do with the fact that the money sort of concentrates at the top of the income distribution, and people don't know where to invest it, where do they put it? Into debt. So then you get debt plus declining growth, and then you have other sort of theoretical linkages, like if actors are too indebted at a given point, even with an interest rate of 0, you cannot get them to take up more debt. Or you make those that lend out their money so suspicious about the chance of it being repaid that they think about something else. They move it in an overblown financial system. And now you see that this these three things are accompanied by the growth, and I don't have to tell you, growth of a financial system which is sort of unprecedented in the history of capitalism. In 1990 in the United States, 14% of profits in this economy came from the financial sector. In 2008, it was 40%, 40, and the curve goes straight up. I'm fascinated with these curves, with these trajectories, and my question is, and that's the hard question to ask. Someone says, yeah, but we've seen Walmart and they raise the wages.
Yeah.
And then my hard question is, can you specify a hypothesis as to the forces and the events that could disentangle this, these three spirals downward, that could stop them? Not just in the United States, but in this system. Globally. And how do you isolate these three things out of their interdependence and mutual reinforcement? And then I think that question really raises the issue of the historicity of capitalism. Yeah, it could be, and when I talk about the historicity of capitalism, John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, Werner Sombart, Joseph Schumpeter, John Maynard Keynes, I mean, these are the real biggies. Yeah, they all believed that capitalism would exist for 3 or 4 more decades, counted from their time, and then it will be gone. Yeah, but then I think the fact that a prediction has not materialized, and that it has not materialized another time and another time, logically doesn't mean that it could not materialize.
Sure.
Because there's no inductive proof.
No.
That's what I learned in philosophy. There's no
Yeah.
inductive proof.
So actually we end with the statement, which is a play on, of course, the title of one of the books of your colleague Colin Crouch, The Strange Non-Death of Capitalism.
Of neoliberalism.
And that was his title, but you suggested that it's actually about capitalism.
Yeah.
Because that is what have been predicted and never occurred. So it's a strange non-death.
Yeah.
Of course, the way in which you present it, it is quite a difficult core to undo these downward cycles related to inequality, declining growth, and indebtedness, which raises all sorts of questions about which political agent, how to organize, how to mobilize. But I want to bracket that question and reserve that for the last part of our talk, and then move briefly, because you already indicated, or you already said something about that issue. Talk briefly about Germany. One of the key sort of sociological concepts that you have minted and added to the social science lexicon is the notion of beneficial constraints. And you already indicated that capitalism can only work under conditions of constraints which allow it to reproduce itself over time, because it requires all sorts of moral resources which otherwise get depleted. This is from a 1997 paper that you wrote. And you referred, in terms of those constraints, to basically both moral or cultural patterns as well as legal patterns related to the requirement of German firms to legally set up works councils, to pay for vocational training, to do wage bargaining, etc., etc. Basically, it's the whole arrangement of tripartite kind of negotiations that you just referred to. And when you wrote that piece, it was still on the backdrop of Germany, which was then still seen to be a successful, highly successful manufacturing machine. It was the second Wirtschaftswunder, if you wish, of Germany, the early 90s. And then, of course, when you got back to Germany, I don't know whether there's any causality implied, Germany was increasingly, after the reunification with East Germany, seemed to be a basket case. It was the sick man of Europe. And now, 20 years later, Germany is again perceived to be a model for the rest of Europe. And my question related to these two models, is it the same model? And what has actually changed? If you look back 20 years ago and now, and is it actually a model for the rest of Europe?
This is a fascinating question, and to answer it, but don't be afraid. To answer it, you need to tell a historical story. Yeah?
Sure.
As in institutional economics, or the normal standard economist will tell will say that institutional economics is simply storytelling. Simply telling a good story is a very difficult thing to do. You need to understand a lot, and unfortunately for the standard economist, you're not dealing with models or systems. You're dealing with historical courses, trajectories, which are subject to all kinds of contingent events, plus let's say contradictions in an old Marxist language. Now, looking at the German thing, I think I know this story, and I think I've understood it. When we wrote about the beneficial constraints, that was to explain why a society or a political economy in which trade unions were surprisingly strong, why that society could also be successful. And it held out the social democratic promise.
Absolutely.
That you can have a laborist political economy in a capitalist economy. A few years later, contingent processes, we were at a different point. And the point was that with globalization, that is with the opening of the borders, our companies did what I predicted sort of in a throwaway line in the first essay on beneficial constraints, namely that this applies only to captive capitalists. You can educate only captive capitalists. If they can go, they will use the easier way. So after 1989, they could take their production technology and put it into Hungary and work with workers who were much less demanding than German workers, for good reasons. And so you see how more and more parts of the, I talk about autos because this is always was my reference industry. You could see how more and more parts of the production of the product were imported from places where you didn't have to have demanding production concepts. Moreover, then now we move into the 2000s, and what we already saw was a weakening of trade unions, which sort of where it had the following problem. The national unions were told by their workplace representatives that if you overdo it in the next wage round, our jobs will move to X and Y. So take it easy. Yeah? And there was still sort of a radical wing in power in the metal workers union, which in the early 2000s started a big strike in East Germany to prevent the plants from hiring, for example, precarious workers, dumbing down the jobs. And the local representatives of the union told the union headquarters to stay back because that threatened and that was the moment when IG Metall ceased to think about strikes, even to think about strikes. Yeah, no strike anymore since that moment. Then you had this sort of softening of the beneficial constraints, but you had something else. Then we move into European Monetary Union, and there's where the story becomes complicated in the following sense. You have to remember that the first years of monetary union were the years that Ewald referred to as the years when Germany was the sick man of Europe. Why? Because the German political economy is sort of habitually inflation averse. If you have a big export sector, you can't have inflation, right? The interest rate for Europe, however, was set on the average of the European political economies, and there were a lot of inflation positive, inflation inclined economies now included, so that the interest rate in Europe was higher than the German inflation rate, which gets you in a bad situation. So we were suffering from this, whereas East Germany, Southern Europe, whereas Southern Europe had inflation rates above the rate of interest, which was negative interest rates, wonderful, boom. Whereas Germany, sort of suffering. Now comes 2008, and in 2008, credit doesn't play a role anymore. In the East, in the South, they begin to remember that governments have to pay for their own debt and that nobody else pays for them. Interest rates shoot up. Germany had this sort of historical legacy of a very good engineering industry. And the thing that counted at this moment was, can you sell cars to China and America and to all these people who want to buy Porsches? And there were a lot of people who want to buy Porsches in these places where inequality was increasing. See, the point is that the German export industry benefits from an unequal income distribution in the United States. Then they can buy the BMW X6. These wonderful, wonderful things. The Chinese come to Germany now and pick up their cars at the producer's place, and then they drive across the German motorway where they can drive as fast as they want in whole columns of black X6s that sort of crisscross the country to really show off, which they can't do in China. Then the car goes to China, and there it sort of has to. So this is the story. Now, from this story we can learn that nothing is cast in steel. something can happen that we now can't anticipate that might lead to something very different. Like demand in China breaking down, Volkswagen will be in a very, very bad spot.
Mm.
Yeah.
So basically you're stating, well, the first German model of the early 90s was a social democratic model.
Yes.
The second German model is a model which is strongly reliant basically on monetary policy effects.
Yeah.
Because that basically means that the competitiveness of German industry is monetarily improved. But what I also want to know...
But let me come in, Ewald.
But it's also based on wage cost arbitrage.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has... See, it's almost perverse. The only contribution that these Hartz legislation made to German competitiveness is that it enabled factories to hire temporary workers on a very large scale. And now even see, when I started studying automobiles, Untertürkheim, which is where Daimler builds their cars, was a place where workers were basically like public officials. They had a job for life. You couldn't find anyone there who would even have thought that Daimler would ever release them. Yeah. Now 50% of the workers in Untertürkheim have time-limited contracts. Yeah. Okay, that is really a change.
The neoliberalization of labor market.
Yeah, this is exactly what. And then add to this the fact that then of course what they benefit on is still that we have these wonderful technische Universität, technical university, where people really learn to do engineering. The Rheinisch-Westfälische Technische Hochschule in Aachen explains 50% of the success of the German automobile industry. Yeah.
And the other 50% is the monetary income.
Yeah, and then comes then comes Mr. Draghi. Draghi, by printing money like mad, sort of drives down the exchange rate for the German economy, which should be $1.60 or $1.70.
For Germany.
For Germany.
Yeah.
For Germany.
Yeah.
Now with the euro, it's $1.
Yeah.
Almost. Yeah. Imagine. Now they kiss the feet of Mario Draghi. Right? Although everybody knows by buying time that if you do this for a longer time, all sorts of negative effects will happen, including the beginning of a potential sort of devaluation, a competitive devaluation on a global scale. If the Italians devalue, not a problem. But if the euro devalues, then the Chinese get nervous.
Sure.
Others get
currency
nervous.
war.
Yeah, a currency war. Yeah. And then we're back in the 1930s.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to move to the book. We're already, of course, talking about the book. It's an angry book. It's also a quite depressing book. We will talk about your sort of political solutions in the final part of this talk. But the book is also a typical, if I may say so, product of the German way of doing sociology. Mm-hmm. It's this is not meant as a form of criticism, but it has functionalist overtones. Mm-hmm. And you talk about systems which are out of equilibrium and might not regain their equilibrium. And what is basically the backbone of the story is a story of different ways of accommodating representative democracy with capitalist markets. And you start out the story with the post-war settlement, the Fordist settlements. It's based on Keynesian political economy, and you call it the fiscal state. So the Steuerstaat, absolutely.
Tax state.
The tax state. And then you sort of indicate, well, it came into crisis, and the crisis was sort of not solved, but accommodated again by this move towards the Schuldenstaat, as you call it, which is based on Hayekian political economy. The Schuldenstaat itself first was basically about public debt in the early 80s. Then on the back also of the Maastricht Treaty, there was this forceful need to bring down debt. And actually what we then from that moment onwards see is a replacement of public debt with private debt, something that, again, your colleague Colin Crouch has called privatized Keynesianism. And then since 2008, or thereabout, we have moved into this new phase, which is called the Konsolidierungsstaat. And basically what we're sort of witnessing or being confronted with is a prolonged period in which states are forced to bring down their debt levels by creating budget surpluses instead of budget deficits, which basically means that we're moving into a period of permanent austerity, which limits tremendously the possibilities of any sort of democratic policy making. And that is basically where the story ends. My question is, this movement from the Steuerstaat to the Konsolidierungsstaat, what is the causal mechanism behind it? What is driving this process? I readily admit that this is a big question, but I can easily imagine that this is sort of trigger enough for you to come up with some sort of an answer to that.
Yeah, thank you for this question. There's always something you have to add to a book, because this is a book. This is relatively short. Capital is a lot longer.
Yeah.
But let me begin by slightly resisting to the notion that there is a functionalist concept of equilibrium here.
Yeah.
Well, what I think I'm doing in the book, and you will all buy it and read it, and then you'll know whether this is true, is I'm attacking this notion of equilibrium by constructing historically these segments of crises that start with solutions. My dialectical idea in the historical part of this is that we go to the 1970s, which is the big turning point. Now everybody realizes this. The post-war period is a period of managed capitalism. I use the metaphor of the predators, the tigers and the lions, having been turned into milk cows by global social democracy. But in the 1970s, they think that living in a cage and being milked every day is not fun enough for them. So they want to get out, and they turn back to becoming. I reconcile. But then comes the interesting part. The 1970s were a period of very high inflation throughout the OECD world. And it was quite clear at the time. In brackets, I would like to say, sometimes it's good to be a little older, like me, because then you remember things. Up to a point, right? I remember when I was a student and when I was young, I was very impressed with John Goldthorpe's work on inflation. Inflation for him was the expression of the absence of a normative schema of distributional justice in a capitalist society, where the two classes sort of meet, fight, and for the government the only way of preventing the system from breaking down is printing more money, so that there could be a money illusion and sort of employment, but you can do this for a while. And in the book I'm saying, remember Goldthorpe, 1970s, that was exactly the period when they bought time by printing money. Yeah. Then comes, however, in 1981 or 1980, what I call the Volcker Revolution. Volcker is the guy who became president of the American Fed at the time, and who stopped inflation, not just in the United States, but everywhere else, by pulling up the interest rate to 20%, producing unemployment under Reagan also up to 20%, and sucking in capital from all over the world, including Europe, and creating unemployment here too. Yeah? There you see. Now then comes the period in which, in this situation, public debt increases everywhere, partly as a matter of decision by governments, partly simply because you had to pay all these social security things to people who were out of work, right? And so then you have, in the literature on public debt, you read that public debt is a device by which governments avoid distributional conflict.
Mm.
And then I think, my God, look at this. From inflation to public debt, and then again, 10 years later, the solution turns into a problem, like inflation too. And in the 1990s, there begins the first wave of consolidation.
Yeah.
And what happens then is that you can't simply consolidate because people have claims to they want to buy their car in order to get to the job. So you have to allow them to borrow. That means you deregulate. Now people get credit who would never have gotten credit before on a collateral that nobody would have accepted as a collateral, but now governments allow banks to do this. In fact, they urge them to do this. Yeah, and then you see, so just as a matter of of sort of cognitive history, I went to very early in the crisis. I went to a conference in a place like Bielefeld. Bielefeld is a small German town, technologically not very well developed. They didn't have PowerPoint. They had these old
overhead projectors.
Overhead projectors.
Yeah.
So you had to have overhead files. I had an overhead file with aggregate inflation for the OECD world. I had one with public debt for the OECD, while one with private debt. And these things are see-through.
Mm.
And I sort of put them on my desk. I looked at them, and I thought, my God, these are like communicating pipes. The inflation goes up, the others are down. And then inflation goes down, public debt goes up.
Yeah.
And then public debt goes down, and private debt goes up. And I thought, wow, the contradictions of capitalist political economies and the tricks that politics has to invent in order to keep the shock going. This is not equilibrium analysis.
No, sure.
It is permanent disequilibrium. And then, of course, in the book, I say, now after 2008, we're in the fourth phase. And I don't quite understand what the fourth phase is. If we had we have a projector, but it would take too much time to do this. The trick in the fourth phase is the increase in the balance sheets of central banks. Mm-hmm. Now, what you observe since 2008 is a tripling of the aggregate balance sheets of central banks in the OECD world. Mm. And the mother of all central banks, which is the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, they print these wonderful diagrams, and you see how it shoots up in all countries, and the aggregate increase is again linear and steep. Mm. Yeah, like my other things. Mm. And then in the world of finance, as you know, people are debating the question: how long can we continue this?
Sure. Yeah.
And at the International Monetary Fund, this guy Larry Summers, master deregulator of the American financial sector in the 1990s, sort of showed up and told the assembled central bankers, friends, we have a problem here. We might be facing secular stagnation. And then he says, in spite of all the money we've produced, in spite of the public debt, in spite of the private debt, we never get back to the growth rates that we need in order to keep the shock together. Yeah. Ewald, not equilibrium analysis.
No,
not at all.
But it still sounds like a process rather than a project.
Yes. And my own what I've learned in this thing is the decomposition of agency, even of the hope for agency, and that's the pessimistic part. Yeah. The social democrat in my own life experience was one who could still develop constructive ideas as to cope with these problems. I abstain from this today because I think it is an illusion and it minimizes the impact of what I say about the depth of the problem.
Mm.
If I tell you, now we see all these trajectories, but now I tell you how we get out of this, you go home and you feel good. You should not feel good. You should think there really is something strange going on.
And on this note, let's move to the fourth part of the conversation, which is about Europe.
Yeah.
Because what you were just talking about is basically global capitalism, the wondrous sort of processes going on within global capitalism, which it's very hard to think of any sort of political actionable agency with regard to how to ensure that it becomes more citizen friendly. But with regard to the euro problem and the euro crisis, it might be possible to think through some of the political alternatives. Let me go back to some of the earlier writings in your career, because you have written extensively on the project of European integration, and I sort of also in my teaching always mention your name together with the name of your co-director and colleague Fritz Scharp. Mm-hmm. The two of you have always emphasized the huge asymmetry in the European integration project. It's all about negative integration and not about positive integration. And to briefly translate that, it's all about market making, the internal market, and it's much harder to come up with any sort of consensus about what kind of policies we need on a European level to correct the effects of these market processes. And this has basically been the dominant theme in your writing about the European integration process. But it was still, it was critical, but it was constructively critical. But since the outbreak of the euro crisis in 2010, you have increasingly become a vociferous critic of the way in which the crisis has been managed by the European political elites. And I again have some quotes from Gekochte, Zeit. Bear with me with regard to the bad pronunciation of my German, but that's okay, I guess. And I simply start with the first sentence on page 250. Die Europäische Währungsunion war ein politischer Fehler, weil sie trotz der enormen Heterogenität der Länder der Eurozone die Abwertung eliminiert hat, ohne zugleich mit ihr auch die Nationalstaaten und die Demokratie auf nationaler Ebene abzuschaffen. And of course it's pretty obvious that you, throughout the text of this book, indicate that basically your moral standpoint is coming from democratic theory, that this is of course a cynical formulation. 256, second quote, im Westeuropa, that's basically the last paragraph of the book, im Westeuropa von heute ist nicht mehr der Nationalismus die größte Gefahr, schon gar nicht der deutsche, sondern der hayekianische Marktliberalismus. Die Vollendung der Währungsunion würde das Ende der nationalen Demokratie in Europa besiegeln. These are highly critical quotes about the European project, which are sort of hard to reconcile with the mainstream social democratic constructive critical voice that you had formulated earlier with regard to the European integration project. So again, why? What happened? Etc., etc. Why have you become so hugely critical of the European project?
I think I've learned something, it's even more pronounced the difference. Before I went to America in the late 1980s, I worked with the European Metalworkers Confederation in Brussels for a European concept for shop floor co-determination, trying to
That was your book on Works Council.
Yeah, Works Council. Yeah, absolutely. And the idea was in part to explain to my British friends and my Italian friends that it was not such a bad idea for unions to play a role on the shop floor. It was impossible to explain to them. They liked me, I liked them, but after a few beers they would tell me it would never fly in Britain, would never fly in Britain, or they would never in Italy. We hate management, we can't work with them. My idea was that the strength of a union comes from its voice at the place of production, and in order to have a voice you have to have someone else who listens, and as a result you need to work with management, but from a position of strength, not like today from a position of weakness. And so I took this with me and then observed, and I was sort of someone who believed in what was then called the social dimension of the European of the European Union. Jacques Delors, in his first time, sort of made the social dimension the big issue. In his second period, he switched completely to a supply side economics, and there was no talk anymore of the social dimension. In fact, nothing flew. There were two sort of directives that were passed in Brussels, and then it was over, because the 1990s had begun, and you could say it's the 1990s, friends. It's not enough to just be a worker. You also have to be a capitalist, and so it was the 1990s. And I came back in 1995, and the German Trade Union Confederation has a big training center, the Akademie der Arbeit in Frankfurt, and asked me to speak on the occasion, I think, of their 40th or 50th anniversary, and I gave my first really critical assessment of the state of the... And I said to them, look, you're going to be screwed if this continues. If this continues, they will drive out not just the European social dimension, but the social dimension at the national level. They didn't believe me because they like good Germans, they loved Europe, European integration. I am convinced that this book was written, I think, a few months after Angela Merkel and her friends had appointed this guy Papademos as Prime Minister in Greece, and this guy Monti as Prime Minister in Italy. And I thought, where am I living? That she can do this, and her friends. And then you'll find this in the book. Then looking at this guy Papademos, I found out that he had been the chief of, you wouldn't believe it, the Greek central bank at the time when Goldman Sachs explained to them
salt is derivatives.
And how to suck the money out of Brussels so that it gets into Greece. When they persuaded. In the book, I think, or somewhere else, I've said, and I stand by this, if these people had been private bankers giving advice to an individual how to use their money, they would now be in prison for talking them into a business that could only have gone wrong. Right? They would now be in prison für wie sagt man, Beratungsbetrug. Then this guy Monti, who was one of the who had spent his time in Brussels trying to destroy the German Sparkassen and Genossenschaftsbanken. That is the banking system that was not completely private, but semi-public, on the reason that this was not compatible with European competition law, right? So these people were not unknown. They had their hands up to here in whatever they had their hands in. So I thought, okay,
some sort of a till.
Yeah. And of course they had both worked for Goldman Sachs.
Absolutely.
And I thought, no, is this European democracy? This is where I say. Then my former teacher, or my teacher, because he remains my teacher forever, Jürgen Habermas, on the completely different side of the political aisle, sort of thought that now was the moment to jump out of national democracy into supranational democracy. I know Europe a little bit better than he does because I've lived in several countries. I cannot see that we can do this within a matter of 2 or 3 or 4 years. This will be a very, very careful process of institution building, and it will, in the process, involve not just creating a democratic state at the European level. It will involve a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between state and economy. Because my argument would be, you cannot do democratic theory without doing political economy at the same time. And Habermas has given up political economy 20 years ago to do a theory of communicative action. And my point is that designing a democracy without spending a serious thought about how the institutions of a democracy should relate to the market economy or to capitalism is a total waste of time. Yeah? Democracy is not just communication. Democracy is intervention in market processes that function according to St. Matthew 19, I think it's St. Matthew 19:29, where it says, "He who hath will be given, and he who does not have will be taken away whatever he has." Whatever he does. This is what Jesus says in St. Matthew. Doesn't
according to St. Matthew, of course.
According to St. Matthew. And actually he talks about faith, not money. Yeah? But since in our world, money is the only faith that we have left. I quote this in order to illustrate how a market functions. And this is, the sociologists call it cumulative advantage. Great, fine, as long as you have the tools to correct that cumulative advantage by education policy, by social security policy, by all of these things. If you see that these things are slowly drifting away, that universities get privatized, that pensions get privatized, that jobs get more and more temporary, if you see that happening, and then just talk about democracy, that is not enough. Then you might end up with a democracy that has nothing to say. And this is what Colin calls post-democracy. A system where you can sort of talk a long time about the president of France using a bicycle, using a motor scooter to see his lover. Very interesting issue. Yeah? But the president of France, right now, has no power to protect the French 35 hours week from the onslaught of French and international capital, which tell the president that if people work only 35 hours, so that man and woman can share responsibility for their family, right? That as long as you have this rigid dictatorial regime, unfortunately they can't invest in France. And then a socialist president tells his voters, unfortunately, we have to do something about this bizarre 35 hours week. We have to work like the Germans, 41 hours. Yeah. For me, it would be ideal if we would adopt what do we need all the money for? But then you have issues of industrial structure, distribution and redistribution, debt that has to be paid off, right? Graeber, if I may say that, Graeber in his book on 5,000 years of debt, he, like very few other people, understands what debt is. Debt is a bond in the sense of bonding someone to a duty that you can later extract from him. And I give you a little anecdote on this. My own work on industrial relations when I was in America, I watched a new plant that General Motors was building in the vicinity of Wisconsin, where I was. So that was for initially 1,500 jobs, and they had 100,000 applications for people who wanted to work there. So I spoke to the personnel manager and asked him, what do you do with 100,000? How do you even begin? He says, basically, it's not so difficult. I look at two things. Do they have children, and do they have a mortgage? And then they come on the short list. And then I asked him, why a mortgage? And he told me, someone who's got to pay off a mortgage will never go on strike.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Wow! I thought, I've learned something.
Before I'm going to wrap up this part of the talk, one final question which relates to the euro crisis. As you've indicated, it's basically a monetary straitjacket, which is very beneficial for some German capitalists and some Dutch capitalists, but it's highly disadvantageous for a large number of citizens, not only in Greece, but basically across the Eurozone. What should we do with it? In your book, you sort of suggest that you're in favor of letting states regain the right to de-evaluate. Doing that suggests basically a different design of this monetary union or a complete disbandment of monetary union. What kind of more technical proposals do you have in order to recreate the right to de-evaluation?
I'm not a technician in these things, but in here I can rely on the greatest mind, or one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes. And in 1944, Keynes was the one who, in 1918, during the Versailles treaty negotiations, understood that what they were doing was they were setting up World War II.
Absolutely.
And he wrote
it's a brilliant book.
Yeah, it's a brilliant book. He wrote a book.
Do that.
He wrote a book. The British Prime Minister offered him the Treasury, so he should become a member of the government, finance minister. And he resigned from the. He said no. He resigned from the delegation, went to Cannes, I think, and wrote this book. In 1944, he had the chance to do better. The world had the chance to do better. So they met at Bretton Woods and designed a monetary system. So Keynes told them that the problem, there were two problems with monetary systems, international monetary systems. One is they could be too rigid, like the gold standard. He said the gold standard is incompatible with democracy. Incompatible with democracy. Yeah, we now have a gold standard in Europe. And then he also said what we can't have is freely floating currencies, because that creates disorder. Also. So what do we have?
It's incompatible with capitalism.
Also, absolutely true. Unpredictable and so on. So what do we need? Something in between. And he suggested what he called a basket currency, so put together from commodity prices or the different national currencies, however, technical problem. And all currencies, national currencies, would sort of like planets around the sun, sort of adjust their relationship to the basket currency, and there would be a World Bank and an International Monetary Fund, which would, in case that some of these countries would be unable to maintain their exchange rate with the central currency, would allow them in an ordered process to devalue or to revalue upwards. Sometimes that's also necessary. So the Bancor, it was called. Everybody was enthusiastic because this was sort of the middle solution between the two extremes, not without problems, but capitalism is not without problems. So that was a way of avoiding the craziness of the interwar period. What then happened was that the Americans said, wonderful, except we make one little change. Forget about the Bancor, and we put the dollar in there. Yeah? That was the time when America became sort of the center of the capitalist world, and that worked for two or three decades quite nicely until the Americans after the inflation that has resulted from the Vietnam War, dropped out. Then Connolly, who was the finance minister of Nixon, at a meeting of all these finance ministers, said the memorable thing to them: the dollar, to the rest of the finance, the dollar is not our problem; it's your problem. Yeah. And so then begins a period in which for 20 years, for the 30 years that I described in the book, we are sort of wrestling worldwide for a replacement for the Bretton Woods regime. And in Europe, our solution, out of the snakes and all these things that Giscard and Schmidt in the 1970s, we, for some strange reason, arrive at a replication of the gold standard.
Absolutely. Incompatible with democracy.
Incompatible with democracy, as Keynes knew.
Yeah.
But there was a short time when it could have been different. And that was from 1998 to 2001 or 2, whenever the latter was the moment when the national currencies were exchanged for these wonderful pieces of paper that are called the euro. And that was a time when the euro was still in existence, and the national currencies were coupled to the euro, and sort of firmly coupled through the Maastricht Treaty. One could have remained at this point and sort of loosened the coupling. Yeah? Then one would have been back to a replica of the original Keynes solution. A general currency for everyone, and then national currencies sort of interacting with it, so to create some sort of flexibility. One could also have multinational currencies, like why not Belgium, the Netherlands? Oh, Belgium is too indebted, but assume Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, Benelux currency, and the German, and the Italians, and don't know about the Greeks. Even the Greeks could be included in this. Yeah? No, that they didn't. What they did was they took away the national currency and gave out the euro, which is when the disaster began. Right? And because now the disasters, why is the euro incompatible with democracy? Or why is the gold standard and therefore the euro? It's very simple. In a flexible international currency regime, you can devalue the currency, and that would be a parameter by which you defend the competitiveness of your economy with a given structure. If you can't do this, the only thing that remains is the reform of the structure. Reform. That is, you have to introduce a flexible labor market, no debt, savers, like in Germany, they all have to go to Italy. This is why Monti said to the Italians, I want to re-educate you. You should be like the Germans, because then you fit very nicely under the euro, and you will prosper. It only means that for a short time you have to live with 15% lower standard of living, but then you are competitive, and then markets will lead to convergence, which is the big lie. The St. Matthew principle is the opposite. Yeah, and then you will have sort of convergence. You will go on, and you will come closer to the Germans. Except that for a couple of years, you will have to take a little cut in your income.
25%, 30%?
Yeah, this is something that the specialists sort of argue about. I would think that the Mediterranean countries, on average, would have to take a cut of 20-25%, and that would mean that's completely impossible. This is why Keynes said the gold standard is not compatible with democracy. Which electorate will support this if their own government tells them, guys, I'm sorry, and then you get these distributional things. Who will suffer first? If a country begins to suffer, you want a government that distributes the suffering in such a way that those at the top suffer more than those at the bottom. But here comes neoliberalism. The opposite has to happen in order for growth to take off. See, neoliberal economists have two different anthropologies as far as people are concerned. They're different in the following sense. For the rich, or the well-to-do, or the Leistungsträger, as you say in German, to work harder, you have to give them more money. Incentive. For the poor to work harder, you have to take money away from them.
That's striking, isn't it?
Yeah. It's, and it's a sort of different labor supply curve. Yeah? And the exciting thing is that they are both, there's something to it. So Marx describes in the chapter on primitive accumulation how these medieval workers in England, who basically when they had enough money on Thursday evening, they would not show up on Friday. Because they were subsistence oriented. And then the government or the king or whoever had to depress their wage in order for them to work more. Yeah, this is the model Marx. So in anticipation,
we now have mortgages for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Marx even couldn't anticipate that the neoliberal logic was to take that money away from them and give it to them up there, so they also work harder. Yeah.
Wolfgang, we have to.
Yeah, we have to stop.
And I think that we no, that's wonderful. We covered most of the themes in the book, I guess, and we did even some excursions to other work that you've published. We talked about the current mutations in global capitalism, but I can imagine that this huge audience also has some questions for you, and we can take a couple of questions. So. If everyone wants to pose a question, then I'm pretty sure that most of you will remain disappointed. But 3 or 4 questions, depending on the length of your answers, of course, Wolfgang.
Yeah, I will.
We should be possible to take. Yeah, there is a question in the back of the room, and if you please, yeah, there is a microphone, and stand up, and state who you are, and then pose your question.
Hi, I'm Jelian Bendy. I have a question of Wolfgang. I noticed you keep saying that these new developments of capitalism are really scary. There's lots of scary things happening. But isn't that precisely the problem of the left, that they perceive this all as scary? One could also argue that if capitalism becomes unlivable, then people will have to do something to make it livable.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
In short, then people will have to respond to this. Every word in this sentence is a problem. Who is the people? The then is a problem. What is the point? What is the tipping point when things become too unlivable? Who is the people? And what is the something? And why do they have to? Do they have the capacity to do that? Politics tells you that you need organization. In order to have organization, you need communication, you need structures of action. I think we have to reinvent all this at the global scale where we are now. And that is a very difficult process. My own expectation would be that it would take a very long time of a very unpleasant situation, like now in Spain or in Italy, sort of becoming ingrained in the life of a society before we know how we can respond to this. Your statement is completely acceptable. At the same time, think about its implications and what it really means. And you will see that there's many problems behind this sentence.
And there was a question from a gentleman with the red sweater here in front.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Harry Bellion. I worked for a couple of years in Brussels also, in the same building as the European Metalworkers at work, for the European Federation Building of Woodworkers. I have noticed that the trade unions in various European countries, also in the Scandinavian countries, always were having a strong position when they were in alliance with the Social Democratic Party. When the socialists in Sweden lost the elections, the trade unions were in disarray, because they didn't know what to do with it. In the past, they always could go, if they had some wishes, they could go to their political party, and then it was okay. With the new right-wing government, they suddenly have no idea how to act. And in some countries where you see that the trade unions have lost membership, they lack young members, they lack minorities, they lack women, etc. for a long time. Now they're catching up, of course. You see that the trade unions don't have the position they had 20, 25 years ago.
Absolutely.
Organizational degree has gone down. The means they can put forward are going down. How can we rely on new social forces with alliance with the trade unions, because in the end workers have to organize themselves one way or another to be a real strong countervailing power to fight deregulation, liberalization and correct globalization?
Yeah, the decline of unions, especially in Scandinavia, preceded the loss of the government on the part of the Social Democratic Party. In Sweden, it was always sort of a careful balance between the unions of the public sector, domestic-oriented, and the unions of the export sector, which controlled the wage setting in the solidaristic wage policy. And so Sweden was always able to play a very complicated game with the rest of the global economy by basically the metal workers taking the leadership in the union movement. And that ended at some point, weakening the unions, and as a result, weakening the Social Democrats. Social Democrats didn't know anymore who to listen to. Was it to be industrial policy, export strength, or was it to be basically the domestic services, especially, which was also a state feminist complex, versus the males at Saab and Volvo. So there was a division first, and then the Social Democrats lost orientation. Very complicated. It's not just the one way around. Very complicated. Which to me is part of this problem of reconstituting agency in our societies and the fragmentation of the forces that kept the system together, or even more importantly, contained the advance of the capitalist development process up to the 1970s. And then, of course, another thing in Sweden which weakened the left was the Meitner Fund and the idea of a sort of slogan. I was an admirer of Rudolf Meitner. We knew each other from the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin, where he spent 2 years. And I was very young. I always went to him and said, Rudolf, tell me more about how you do this, yeah, and how you take the super profits of large firms and then buy up their stock and thereby gradually move into socialism. A big misunderstanding of the nature of social democracy and capitalism.
We're doing two questions, and I have to. I'm awfully sorry, but we do this in order of appearance. So it's the gentleman here with the green coat, and then there is the gentleman with the checkered shirt, and that's it. But Professor Streeck is available after this talk for all sorts of questions.
Yeah, if he can concentrate after.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. My name is Ronald. I've got a question to both speakers. My question is dealing with the influence of the United States in the development of global capitalism, specifically taking into account two effects. First of all, the Federal Reserve is owned, as you probably know, by a couple of private institutions. One of them is the Goldman Sachs Bank. Secondly, do you think is the United States to be considered from a legal perspective a democracy, taking into account that you've got this filibuster role, which means that for any law to be accepted by the Senate, at least 60% of the votes have to be available for discussion. And that means that there is always a blocking minority of 41% of the votes. So my question is aiming at how will the United States, with these two effects in mind, be guiding the future of capitalism? Thank you.
Yeah, the democracies have different rules in different countries, and supermajorities are not necessarily the problem. Although in this case, blocking of the system to an extent. To me, more important is the fact that only 50% of Americans vote. The rest have forgotten about any hope in politics. That the union movement has almost completely disappeared now. That the finance, it's not so much that the Fed is owned by private banks, but the real problem, I think, is the Treasury and the sort of enormous exchange of personnel from the banking system to the state system. It's unbelievable, the sort of rotating door situation. And yes, add to this that the United States is as a country, is in a situation where it commands a lot of political economic power without any constraint to use it responsibly. That's the end since the end of Bretton Woods. The dollar is your problem, not ours. And what you see, for example, is the fact that the United States still commands the reserve currency of the world, although there's no controls anymore on the amount of dollars that they print. They can do what they want with the dollar, since everybody else has to hold these dollars in their central banks, and they will never bring them back. They have a free lunch, essentially, and this is a sort of temptation to be irresponsible, which is only comparable to the fact that they live on this huge island, and they can mess up any country in the world. And nothing will happen ever to them. Right? They can mess up Iraq, and in the United States, I tell you, I lived there for 10 years. All you see is on television that the Americans have again lost a battle, but that's all. The Iraqis will never come to invade the United States.
I'm not going to add anything to what Wolfgang just said about the United States, but what I sort of find quite striking is that what we see happening in Brussels is the development of a political machine which has strong similarities with the American political machine, which basically means strong lobbying entrances for corporate interests, the revolving door sort of aspect, former commissioners like Nelly Kroes of the Netherlands, who basically sells her Rolodex to Bank of America. So ultimately, that sort of means that we're moving into a situation in which it's no longer one woman, one vote, but $1, one vote. And that, especially if you see that in the context of what Wolfgang has talked about, the increasing inequalities not only among citizens, but also between citizens on the one hand and large corporations on the other, basically means that we're really entering into a territory which could be called post-democratic. And that's a frightening sort of perspective. Okay, final question.
Hello, thank you for your interesting talks. My name is Goethe Schouten, for real. And I'm somewhat of a political ecologist. And I think we're actually buying time in two ways. One is we're creating bubbles. The bubbles are related to financial capitalism or monetary capitalism, and they need to be deflated, and that's a big problem. The second is we're also heavily dependent on natural resources for the whole economy. Actually, very
interesting. You didn't talk about that in your book.
No, I explain why.
Okay.
Well, actually, it's really funny. There is a book, maybe it's 10 years old. It's called On Borrowed Time, and it deals exactly with mineral resources and the like. Somewhere I read an estimation that 70% of our economic growth might be even based on fossil fuels, because we really rely that much on energy to pump up the whole system. So it struck me that also the topic of oil is neglected by, for instance, spaghetti. And he seems to think or hope that somewhere over the course of this century we might go back to 2 or 3% growth a year. And then we'll get back to some kind of welfare capitalism. And what I hear of most social democratic lines is that they also neglect this theme of natural resources and seem to hope that we actually will get back to some kind of comfortable growth, which I think is not feasible for the remainder of the century. So I'd like to hear your comment. Maybe they will also say something to that.
This is an issue that I don't know enough about in order to feel comfortable saying something definite on it. I sympathize with all these, you could say Malthusian arguments, because they are immediately plausible. There is an end to things, and the question is how close are we to it? Peak oil is a story, as far as I can see, of a moving target. We had peak oil for a long time, and then suddenly someone invents a new technology, and it's no longer peak oil, or peak oil is 20 years off. So imagine, in terms of energy, if they invented nuclear fusion. I used to work for the Max Planck Society. Can't imagine the enthusiasm of our physicists. It's also a moving target, because already 20 years ago they told us that it took only 5 years and they would have a functioning fusion reactor. Now they are telling us it would take only 15 years and they have a functioning fusion reactor, and it costs so much. So this is why I thought I should not base much of an argument on this. It is completely additive, in the sense you can add this to the things. And in fact, if I may so draw on some meanwhile well-known theory, the theory of Karl Polanyi on the 3 fictitious commodities. That is 3 resources that under capitalism tend to be treated like commodities, but cannot be treated like commodities if the world is to survive. And the first of these commodities, fictitious commodities, is labor, as Marx shows in the chapter on the working day. The second is money, because it shares with labor the property that you cannot increase it in line with the demand. Then obviously we would have too much money. And the third is land, as Polanyi said, nature. And there's the idea already in the 1930s, 1940s, that this is another constraint. Polanyi argues that on all these 3 fronts, you need very strong political regulation in order for the, let's say, half commodification of this to work, and capitalist expansion not taking over the whole thing. So you can't sell land, but we're in the Netherlands here, and this is something that is very much here the case. You need very careful land management in order to be able to use land. Labor, you need to limit working time for labor to be able to reproduce. And money, we've seen in 2008 what happens if you open up the money supply all over the place just to keep the party going. And in that sense, it fits in my picture, but I don't know, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a biologist, I don't know enough about it to pronounce on it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to dodge that bullet, if that's okay with you. I want to wrap up this session, this Q&A, There are going to be drinks. I don't know where they're going to be served.
In the cafeteria downstairs.
In the cafeteria downstairs. You're all cordially invited to come to the drinks. Wolfgang will there be too. And he will be available for signing some of the books that you're, again, cordially invited to buy.
Yes, please.
But I'm going to make a final sort of observation, which is quite striking. It's a quote from you during this conversation. You stated that the older you get, it's good to get older because then you remember things. And one of the issues that sort of comes clearly out of your answers to the questions is the crucial importance of history.
Yeah.
And one of the issues related to the lack of countervailing powers is that apparently we have failed to organize our collective memory in such a fashion that we do know that there is an alternative to the way things are now, which actually at the end of the day is a warm plea to delve deeper into history, the history of capitalism, but basically any history of any sort of building. This, one way or the other, the history of this building is also related to the workings of Dutch capitalism in the 17th century. History is actually a crucial resource for any form of political mobilization. And on that note, give Wolfgang a warm applause. It was very good. It was very, very good.